Good day. Today we're here to take a look at the economy kits that are on the guitarbuilding.org website, which are a partnership with Art V Industries and Cosmo Guitars. And so this particular kit...
I'd put your stem guitar project, all that sort of stuff. I'd do that one over.
Okay.
I'd lead off with your stem guitar, guitarbuilding.org.
Got it.
And then with the partnership.
Okay. Good day. Today we're going to be focused... Yeah, thank you. Just power the bitch down.
No ringtone.
Good day. Today we're going to be working on the economy kit guitars. Guitarbuilding.org's The STEM Guitar Project is what we're basing this.
So your first intro was good.
Yeah.
What you could do is just
So
run through a quick little intro. And substitute it out.
It's okay.
I wouldn't mention the numbers, like the numbers of the body versus the neck.
Well, that's an important component, though.
Yeah, it's
so I won't say you make it next. I'll just say on the pre-made necks, make sure your numbers align.
Yeah.
That way it works. All right. All right. Good day. Today we're going to be working on developing and assembling the Economy Kit guitar, which is a partnership of the STEM Guitar Project and our guitarbuilding.org website, along with Art V Industries. And so this particular kit is imported to help keep the costs low. However, it's a fully functional guitar kit and allows you to do some customization and fun finishing opportunities with it. So let's unbox it and take a look and see what actually ships inside the box here. And so when you first open the box, everything comes pre-wrapped with the foam plastic already on it. And so the bodies themselves are mahogany. And so when you unwrap the bodies, you're going to see that the kit itself is already quite finished. I mean, it's very smooth. It's been sanded at least to 220, but we'll talk more about sanding in a second. The neck, which is a pre-made neck, also comes pre-finished. And so this particular neck has all the frets already inserted, the fret dots and the side markers are already placed in the guitar neck already. So when you're working with the actual parts themselves, you want to make sure that you place them in a Ziploc bag or a storage container, because over a multi-week build, you don't want to lose any of these parts, and some of them are extremely small screws. So when we take a look at the guitar body itself, it already comes pre-sanded, and it's about to the level of about a 220 grit sand. Now, the thing about the mahogany is that it is a wider grain wood, which means that there are some areas that you want to put a sealer on it. Now, if you're going to finish this naturally and as a natural finish, what you can do is you can apply True Oil. And so the True Oil finish works really well, and the first coat of the True Oil finish is actually the sealer and helps fill in some of the grain that you work with. But even before you get to the finish, there's a couple of steps that you want to follow. First off, you do want to go back and re-sand it at 220. It's really a good idea to use a sanding block along with it. That just keeps it easier and level when you're actually doing the sanding on the guitar body itself. And so make sure that you sand everything. And so not only do you have to use a sanding block, but you also want to use the sandpaper. And when you use the sandpaper, fold it into a third. If you fold it into a third, you'll actually get the most usable space out of a piece of sandpaper. Because as you finish each of the sides, when you're sanding, you can unfold and have a brand new surface to actually work with. So that triple fold sandpaper is a great little trick when you're actually working on the finish of the guitar. So before you actually put finish on it, and after you've sanded the first 220, you want to get a wet paper towel. And this is called a grain raise step. And when you grain raise, what happens is that it reintroduces a little bit of moisture into the wood itself. Wipe the wet paper towel over the guitar, let it dry. Once it's dry, go back and then resand it with the 220 grit sandpaper. You'll actually notice that it feels even smoother after the grain raise, even though you didn't increase the grit of the sandpaper, making it making smaller scratches into the wood, but it will actually feel smoother because you've now brought out a little bit more of the grain and cut it off with the sandpaper. You can do this again and do another light grain raise. If you do it a second time, then I would suggest going with a higher grit sandpaper. Go to a 320 or a 400 grit sandpaper. Typically, though, you don't want to use 400 until you actually have finish on the guitar body itself. But 320 would be a perfect grit to use for that second grain raise. So we were talking about finish, and we mentioned the Tru-Oil finish. And the Tru-Oil product is actually a good product to use overall. And what's nice about it is that it's simple to use, and you can actually just apply it onto a rag and wipe it on it. And so there's no spraying involved. There's no serious mess associated with it. It is good to wear gloves with it if you're going to be doing a large surface area. But actually, you just rub the Tru-Oil on. It soaks into the wood. The first couple of coats actually just soak right into the wood. It really enhances the grain, and so hopefully you can see how the grain is enhanced just by applying just this little bit of Tru-Oil on this piece of wood. As you customize your guitar, you can actually take and customize the body. Now, this particular body has been pretty well radiused. It does have a belly cut already cut into it, and it does have an arm relief already cut into this particular body. However, if you want to change the shape, that's up to you. And so you could actually cut off parts of the guitar as long as it doesn't cut off anything in relationship to the pick guard, the bridge area, or the jack mounting location. So this area would be a no-fly zone, but you do have the ability to change this upper bout of the horn or this lower bout of the guitar body. On the back, same scenario. We've got a no-fly zone in the middle. We'll talk about the assembly process there. And again, here's the upper bout. Got some really good grain that usually shows up with the mahogany. So even just using a simple Tru-Oil stain really does bring out the beauty of the wood. So what about the neck? The neck itself, you've got a neck and the body, and when they're pre-made, they're numbered. So this body has a number of 111. The neck also has a number of 111. And so the idea is that you don't want to mix and match these. So once you have your neck and body, make sure that you note that the numbers go together, because if you mix and match, there's a possibility that the setup of the guitar won't work as smoothly as it possibly can. So make sure that you keep the neck and the body matched up. The headstock, you've got the ability to customize. And so typically what we'll do is we'll sketch out in pencil, and then you can come back and either use a jigsaw, you can use a coping saw, you can use a bandsaw to actually cut out that headstock shape. And so again, safety first, you want to make sure you follow all the safety procedures with any power tools. However, it allows you that ability to totally customize your headstock, which is the signature of each guitar manufacturer, is their headstock design. So all the holes are primarily drilled. However, as you finish, the holes will get filled up, so we might have to pre-drill or reopen up some of the holes again once we have the finish location, or the finish is complete. So we'll assume that we've now applied finish to the guitar, and we'll start working on the next steps, which is actually the assembly of the guitar itself. So let's take a look and see what's actually in the bag here. and we're going to unpack the bag as we're getting ready to start the assembly process. So inside the bag, we're going to find the back cover plate. We've got a cord along with the whammy bar. And what's nice is that it's all pre-packaged, meaning that there's separate packages for each of these items. And so we've got most of the screws and the mounting hardware in one package. And then we also have the guitar tuners and the guitar bridge in separate packages. This one happens to have the jack. It has the neck plate along with a set of strings for the initial intonation and setup of the guitar. So I'm going to set some of this aside as we get started on this particular assembly process. So let's take a look at the pickguard and the wiring associated with it. So as you flip this over, most of the wiring is already completed. However, there are 3 connections that you're going to need to solder on this guitar, which makes this a really perfect guitar as a beginning guitar design. And so wrapped up in the nest of wires here, there is actually 3 wires that we have. So let me unfurl these 3 wires that are not connected. And so these 3 wires, there are 2 black and 1 yellow. Okay, 2 black and 1 yellow. And so the black wires are ground wires. Okay, the black wires are ground wires. 1 black wire is going to go to the bridge. 1 black wire is going to go to the jack. And the yellow wire is going to go to the input of the jack. And so the yellow and the black will then move to the jack and get soldered. This other black wire will get fished to the bridge, or actually it's going to be fished to the spring holder, and it will then get soldered there. So now that we've unfurled the wires, there are no other solder connections. If there is a broken solder connection, one of the nice things that you can do is take a snapshot on your phone with it, and you can see where the different color wires go between that. So you'll notice that there is a capacitor that is soldered at each of the tuner locations. So each potentiometer that is a tone potentiometer has a capacitor soldered to it, and that's what these green items are. Those are the capacitors. The other potentiometer that does not have a capacitor is the volume. And then there's a 5-way switch, which allows you to switch between all 3 pickups on the pickguard. All right, so let's get started on the soldering process. So the first thing first is safety, and so I need to grab my safety glasses, because whenever you're working with something, whether it's a power tool or in this case a soldering iron, we want to make sure that we are safe and protect our eyes. So the soldering iron has been heating up. It is hot. Make sure you don't touch the wrong end. That has happened. So again, safety first. With the particular pickguard, I need to also unpackage the jack. And so the jack was actually in the Ziploc bag here, and I'll pull the jack out. And so the jack is again packaged separately. And so we're going to solder the wires to the jack. Now what you don't want to do is solder the wires to the jack with the pickguard like this, because you actually need to run the wires between the area of where the pickup's set and the jack location. So the jack itself will set in place like that. The pickguard will set in place here, and what we need to do is take the yellow and black wire and then run that into the proper cavity between the pickguard and the jack itself. So I'm going to go ahead and tuck the wires through, and they will come out on the other end here in the cavity of where the jack plate goes. And so I want to make sure that the wires get pulled through. And again, one yellow wire and one black wire is what I'm going to need to solder. And on the jack plate, there is the jack already mounted. So there are two leads with the jack. So you've got the place where the tip ground is located, and then you've got a square and a rounded lead. The square lead is the ground. The rounded lead is actually connects to the tip, which is where the signal comes from. So the rounded lead will get the yellow wire, the square will get the black wire, which is the ground. So one of the other things that you want to do is you want to make sure that since you've put finish on your guitar body, that you protect your guitar body before you actually solder. And so for that to occur, I'm just going to grab a piece of the foam here and use that as my protection, so that way I don't drip any solder on the guitar body itself. Unless, of course, you want that look. Now, here's the other thing. Once you solder the jack and the jack plate, you no longer can remove the pick guard. So the pick guard now becomes a fixture on your guitar. So make sure that when you solder this, that you're ready to do the whole pick guard assembly and that particular process. So we're now getting ready to actually do the soldering on the jack and the wires that come from the pick guard that are going to connect to the jack itself. And so a couple of things need to happen. Number one, I need to put a little bit of solder on the jack leads itself and a little bit of solder on the wires. Doing that makes it easier to connect the two, because then all I've got to do is add heat to the mix, hold the wire in place, add heat, and then it will fuse the wire to the jack itself. There are two modes of thinking here on soldering. Number one is that I can push the wire through the hole and then solder it as a positive connection in that way. And so I can push the wire through the hole, solder it as a connection, and I've got a positive connection. I can also just add solder to the surface and solder the wire to that particular bulb of solder that'll be on the surface of the jack lead. And so either way is correct. When you're finished, you always want to give it the tug test. So you want to tug on the wire and tug on the component. It should not break free at all. So the tug test is our final check to ensure that everything is connected properly. If the wires do not have a long enough lead, you're going to need to strip the wires a little bit longer. And so this particular tool is a wire stripper, and this particular wire stripper works really well with all gauge wires. This happens to be like a 24 gauge wire. But the way that it works is you basically set the wire in place. Let me move the jack out of the way here. Set the wire in place, squeeze the handles, and it strips the wire clean. It is really inexpensive to purchase, and they're really efficient to use. And so you can see that I've now just expanded the area of wire that I have to work with on this particular soldering task. So I'm going to grab some solder. I have a little bit of flux here too in case I need to make the solder flow a little bit cleaner. There is flux in the solder itself. Most electronic solder has flux, which allows the solder to flow well. But I'm going to add a little bit of solder to the wire, and so I'm going to heat the wire up, bring the solder in, and add a little bit of solder to the wire. And I'm going to do this on both wires. These happen to have already twisted leads, so I did not have to twist the leads. And I'm going to do both solder types. So I'm going to add one solder type as a positive connection, And the other solder type, I'm going to add the solder to the lead itself. So the ground, I'm going to actually just heat the ground up, add the solder to it, and then I'll solder the wire to that area of solder on the part. Now, a couple of other prep items. Using alcohol swabs works really well to clean components and clean the surface. You can also use a little bit of sandpaper and rough the surface up so the solder sticks a little bit better overall. So a couple of things that you want to look at is that solder is actually shiny. And so when you're working with the solder itself, you want that solder to be a shiny component. And so I didn't put enough solder on this particular lead, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Same process. I'm going to heat the metal up first, then bring the solder in and let the solder flow and bond to that surface that's now warm. Perfect. We're going to solder the ground lead to the connector on the jack. And so I've already placed solder on the jack and I've placed solder on the wire. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the wire with a pair of pliers, grab the soldering iron, and then first set the wire on the solder location. Then I'll bring the heat in with the soldering iron. And so using the pliers allows you to keep your hands far enough away. And you'll notice that I'm applying the heat above the wire. So I want the wire to heat up along with the solder. And so you'll notice that the connection is already made. I mean, it was really fast. We said we want to do a tug test. So we grab the wire, grab the fixture, it shouldn't pull apart. That's the goal. The other solder connection we'll make is a positive connection. This one will actually run the wire through the little hole first, and then we'll add solder to the whole piece. Now you can bend the end of the wire if you choose to, or you can leave the wire straight. That's your call. If you leave the wire straight, you want to make sure that the wire will not touch where the jack plug will be located, because that will then ground the jack plug out potentially, and so you won't get any sound. So again, just take it easy on the amount of wire that you're working through. So I've got the wire now positively connected. We're going to bring in the solder in the soldering iron. So we're going to heat up the surface first. We'll then bring the solder in and connect both components. So leave the heat in place until the solder begins to flow and connect the two components together. Give it a second to cool. Hold it with a pair of pliers, give it a tug test. We're great. So now that we've got the jack soldered in place, we can go ahead and set the jack in place here into the fixturing, and it will set. Don't worry about screwing it down just yet. It's going to move around a little bit as we continue to assemble the guitar itself. The other component that we have to do is we've got the other ground wire that we're going to be working on here in just a moment. But before we do that, we've got to assemble a few things. The first thing that we have to assemble is the spring tensioner that's actually mounted to the back of the guitar body. And so what's going to happen is that we're going to need to flip the guitar body over, and then once the guitar body is flipped over, we're going to be actually mounting in this cavity the spring tensioner. So to protect the switch and the volume knobs and our freshly soldered jack, I'm going to go ahead and set this on top of some cardboard just so it has a little bit of protection. You can use foam, we've used carpets, but ultimately you don't want that switch to be sitting on any hard surface. That will actually cause it to break and fail. So the tensioner and the screws are in the packet, and they're both in one packeted area. So I'm going to go ahead and open that area, pull out the 2 screws and the tensioner, and we'll begin the assembly process. So the string tensioner actually sets in the pocket, and the screws have holes that are pre-drilled, and so it looks like a claw that's going to hold the springs in place. And what's going to happen is that we're going to run the screws in, and we can do this. Let me find the appropriate hole. There we go. Start by just tensioning it with your fingers to get the 2 screws started in the right positions to get the angle. If you get the wrong angle, this screw could technically come through the face of the guitar. So you want to make sure that you do not start them in a wrong direction. Now these particular screws are number 2. So each screwdriver has a number associated with it. And so this happens to be a number 2 screwdriver. It does say P2, Phillips number 2 screwdriver on that, which means that the tip of the screwdriver is designed for slightly larger screw heads. There are P0 and P number 1 screwdrivers that we'll also be using as part of this assembly process. So theoretically, I can just go ahead and start tightening this in. So the question is how far? And that's always the scenario. With this particular tensioner, I basically thread it up to the shoulder on the screw. So what's the shoulder? The shoulder is the unthreaded part. So I basically thread in the screw till I get to the shoulder, and that allows the tensioner to have a little bit of play in the pocket with the springs. And so again, we're just running the screws in for that assembly process. You can use a power screwdriver to accomplish this task. Make sure though, if you do that, that you set it to a very low setting, so that way you don't strip the screw heads out. And so ultimately what we want to do is have some play for that particular claw. And this allows me to control the tension associated with the springs as part of our environment. So the last wire will actually come through a hole that's in the base of the cavity and will connect to the claw. There's a little punched area that's been stamped that's ready to accept the wire, and so we'll strip the wire a little bit longer, and then what we'll do is solder that to the claw. So I've fished the wire through and I've stripped the wire a little bit longer for that solder connection on the claw that holds the springs. And so again, we can positively connect that wire under the catch, and then we can actually squeeze it with a pair of pliers. And so that will hold it in place, and then we can add some solder associated to it. And so there's, again, different methods to this process. You can also heat the area, put a blob of solder on it, and then solder the wire to that blob of solder. So again, different processes. In this case, the little tab that's been stamped is not wide enough to accept the wire. So in essence, I may need to take a flat blade screwdriver and just bend that tab a little bit taller so the wire fits under it. And again, won't take much. We're just bending that tab up just a little bit so the wire can slide under that so it becomes a positive connection. And then the wire stays in place. And that's the goal. And so you bend that tab up with the screwdriver. You can slide the wire back through under that tab, and then you can actually press that down, or you can just solder it once you've pressed that wire in place. And so I'm going to press the wire in place, which it's now in place, and I can then go ahead and solder that particular wire. So I'm going to tilt it back for a second so I can solder, and we'll show you the finished product here in just a second. So I'm heating the solder joint up at this juncture, and again, since this is a large metal object, I'm going to heat it up for about 20 or 30 seconds before I actually put any solder to it. I want to make sure that that area is warm enough. And so as I bring the solder in, the solder will flow to the wire and the joint of the positive connection that we have. And so ultimately we want to keep it heated until we see the solder to begin to flow and not just remain a giant ball of solder. The giant ball of solder would be considered a cold solder joint and would not be a positive connection. So I've got enough solder. We're now just keeping it warm and heating up the metal so it flows a little bit better. And there we have it. And so you can see that I've now soldered it. If we do the tug test is all set. That wire is not going to go anywhere. So those are the 3 soldering connections that we have to make. So now at this point, we now have to start assembling the other hardware, which encases the bridge and some of the other components. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the guitar back around, take the cardboard box out of the way until we actually put the springs in, and then we'll start next on the bridge assembly. So pickguard again is in place. We now have the soldering connections done. A good time to actually work on this solder connection, once you have them all connected, is actually do a sound check. And so we'll go ahead and grab an amp and we'll do a sound check here for our next segment. So our next step is to actually sound check the guitar itself. This is even before we mount the pickguard and the electronics actually into the guitar body itself. So we've mounted the jack, we've soldered the jack wires to the leads. We've also soldered the bridge ground to the claw plate that holds the springs from the bridge. So now the next step is that we actually want to use an amplifier, and we want to make sure that the amplifier is turned off before we plug the guitar in. So we plug the guitar cord into the jack, turn the amplifier on, and we might hear a buzz, and that buzz is caused from the single coil pickups. These are designed that it will pick up ambient electricity. So 60 hertz, which is the hum that you hear in the background, is what is currently being heard. Fluorescent lights also are a pickup. They're in the 230 hertz range or so. And so ultimately, we want to check and see how the pickups work. So you can hear the difference in the hums. So some pickups have more coils of wire wound in them, and those are typically a higher resistance, and that particular pickup then will produce a higher pitch sound. And so volume wise, and then we can control the tone also between them. So this 5-position switch, the center is the center pickup. If we switch it one towards the neck pickup and the middle pickup play. We switch it all the way forward towards the neck, just the neck plays. Same thing happens on the other end, 2 pickups, and then the single bridge pickup. So this sounds like it's wired and it's working properly. So turn the amplifier off, pull the plug, and then we're able to go on to the next step. So the next step is actually mounting the bridge in place. So we mount the bridge before we mount the pick guard, because the pick guard is going to snuggle the bridge, which means there's going to be a slight reveal around the bridge itself with the pick guard. So the bridge comes pre-assembled, but not pre-set up. And so the idea is that once you have the bridge, you also have a piece of cardboard that you're going to have to slide out, and this prevents it from scratching the chrome while you're actually working and shipping the parts. And we set it, and the front here has got 6 screws, and those are the mounting screws for the bridge itself. So we're going to have to put 6 screws in place. Well, somewhere there are 6 mounting screws. And again, we go back to our hardware kit, and the only spot that we have 6 screws is here, which means that that's the spot that I need to open up next to mount the bridge. So I've now unpackaged the screws for the bridge. And another tip that I can provide is that you can place the screws on the magnets of the pickups. And what that allows us to do is to ensure that the screws don't go anywhere else except for where we need them. By the way, if you're ever looking for a screw, more than likely it's going to be attached to a pickup, whether it's on the bottom or the face of the pickup itself. Because basically they are a magnet. Now when you place screws in the guitar, you'll want to use wax or soap. And in this case, I'm going to put a little bit of soap just on the threads of the screw. And so each screw is going to be just lightly dragged over the soap, or like I said, wax will perform the same task. And again, you always start the screw by hand, not by machine. We can use a machine such as a driver drill next to me to actually drive the screws in. However, we're going to talk a little bit about the setup of the driver drill to ensure that we don't over torque the screw. So driver drills are much safer to use than the hammer drills. The hammer drills work great. However, there's no way to control how much torque is applied to the bit. And usually that will break the screw. And so in essence, most driver drills have a clutch which will stop spinning the bit once it reaches a certain torque associated with that setting. So I'm actually going to set mine really low. And so as I drive the screws in, I want to make sure that I press down on the screwdriver so the bit does not chew up the head of the screw. I'm going to run very slowly. You can also drive the screw in by hand. Now again, if you're going to do this, a good technique is to place one hand on top of the screwdriver, providing a lot of force down so it engages the screw, and then use the other hand to tighten the screw. So this is another technique that you can use to control that you don't over tighten the screw. Okay, so again, soap is the key for successful placement of screws into a wooden guitar body. So at this point, we know that the bridge is set. We can now start to set up and position the rest of our components so we can finish the assembly on the front of the guitar. To do that, we'll start with the jack. Now, depending upon how the jack is positioned, the jack may or may not line up with the holes on the guitar body. So what you want to make sure is that the leads that you soldered are in the downward position, are farthest away from the top hole. So in essence, you might have to rotate the jack so that way the leads are placed to the bottom of the opening. That will allow enough room for the screw hole to be visible through the jack plate. The screws that hold the jack plate and the pick guard are all the same. So that happens to be all these screws in this particular package. Again, open it up. If you open it up near the pick guard, the screws will stick to the pickups, which makes it easy to find and to locate as you begin this process. All right, so the pick guard screws are extremely small. You don't need a giant tool to drive the pick guard screws in. You can do this by hand. So the first screw, and these screws happen to be a number 1. So how did I know that? As I put the screwdriver in, the number 2 screwdriver, it did not feel very snug against the Phillips head. And so the number 1 screwdriver, again it's labeled, will give a better snug feeling on the screw. We should, again, wax or soap the threads of the screws. So again, each screw that you place into the wood should have wax or soap on it. Don't have to over tighten these, just snug it up. So aligning the pick guard, basically I want to place temporarily, and I'll twist them by hand just to hold that position, 3 or 4 screws on the pick guard to hold its location, so that way the holes align around the pick guard itself. So the pick guard screws are all in place. We do have extra screws. So those screws are actually used for the back plate that covers up the claw and the springs. So we want to take those screws and set those aside temporarily on that plate. So the next step is that I've flipped the guitar over, I've put it back on my box to protect the switch and the volume and tone controls. But now I've also unpackaged the springs. And so these springs are designed to connect from the bridge to the claw. And you'll notice that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 claw positions for the springs. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 end holes for the springs in the bridge. And so typically I'll do every other one, leaving the center 2 open as part of this process. I've put my safety glasses back on because this could be a situation where the spring could launch itself across the room. You have to be careful when you apply this because there's a lot of tension on this spring. So safety glasses are an important step. To do this properly, the easiest way is to place the spring with the end into the bridge, the hook, using a small screwdriver through the opening. Stretch the spring over, the claw lead. Riding up today. So stretching the spring over the claw lead requires you to pull it and then to make sure that the screwdriver goes a little bit farther past the claw, and then press the spring down over the claw or the claw fitting. I may have to stand up to do this. There's another way to do this too, which is you loosen the screws up, apply the springs, and then tighten the screws back in, is another way that you can accomplish this task. This, of course, is the more fun way to do this. We're going to loosen it up. Loosening up the claw lowers the tension on the spring, making it easier to connect. And so now we don't have to stretch the spring as far to the claw itself. I'm going to try the center one first. And this one will be successful. So once all three springs are in, you can adjust the tension with using the screwdriver to drive the screws in a little bit farther. The key is to keep the screws about the same distance out of the guitar body. So count the number of threads in the back of the guitar body. You can see that I've now basically threaded out about 3 threads from where it was originally. All right. Let me press the spring in place. So now the springs are in. The soldered wire is there. We can now do a cover plate mounting. Be careful not to lose the screws into the cavity. Now this cover plate does have a front and a back to it. Okay, the back is flat. The front is actually got a pebbled finish, but you can also see that there's recesses for the screws. Make sure that the cover plate has the string holes where the bridge location is. I've seen it where it's been turned around and you have to then replace that particular cover plate. So again, a little bit of soap or wax on the screws. Alright, so now the guitar itself is all buttoned up. We've got the pick guard in place, the bridge is in place, the jack has now been mounted, all the wires have been soldered. We start again on the neck. So now we're going to finish up the neck. So the next step is that we're going to take the tuning machines and put the tuning machines on the headstock. Using the tuning machines, they were in a separate bag. However, the nut, washer, and set screw, or the small screw that sets it in place, is again in the hardware bag. And so we need to open the hardware bag. And again, these screws are really small, so be careful not to lose them. Okay, so all of our hardware is here ready to go. The best way to start is by placing each of the tuners in position The washer has a front side, a shiny side, and a dull side. We want to make sure the shiny side of the washer is up, and then place the nut on top of that washer. I'm going to just hand tighten it, just finger tight. We're going to do that for all 6. And on the back, with the tuners, there is actually a location hole. So this screw is not about tightening the actual tuner to the wood. All this does is prevent the tuner from spinning when you're actually tightening the string on. So again, anytime that we put a screw into wood, we want to put some soap or wax on that screw. This happens to be a number 1 screw again. And so tighten that down with a number 1 screwdriver. Might even be a 0. Let's check and see. Yeah, it is definitely a 0. I felt it slip with the number 1 screwdriver. This happens to be a 0. And so these holes are pre-drilled on the back of this neck, which makes it really easy to locate the position of the tuning machines. If you were to do this on your own, you'd have to align all the tuning machines, tighten them, and then put the screws in place so they don't spin. Alright, so all the tuners are in place. We'll then go ahead and use a 10mm wrench to tighten. And again, all I'm doing is snug, not over tightening, just snugging it up. So again, it's about 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn beyond finger tight is all you need to ensure that the tuner is not going to move. So this happens to be a number 10mm wrench, which is very common for guitar tuners. Alright, so the tuners are now set. The next step is to take the neck and mount it. Okay, so the next step is, now that we've got the tuners in place, we've got all the hardware mounted onto the guitar body, we need to put the neck and the guitar body together. We can also, before we do that, put the 2 strap buttons on each end of the guitar body. And so that is also a great spot to accomplish, or a great step to accomplish here. And so let me get those set up here. And so that comes with basically 2 screws, 2 buttons, and a couple of felt washers. And so the felt washers protect the guitar body finish ultimately. And so we've got the buttons, the felt washers, and the screws. Again, anytime screws go into the guitar body, we want to put wax or soap on them. Screw goes through the button. Felt washer goes under the button. There's pre-drilled holes. This happens to be a number 2. Pre-drilled holes on the guitar body. And so again, something really simple and easy to do is to put the strap buttons on before you mount the neck. So let's put this one in place. I'll leave the other one to do just after we get the neck assembled. And to assemble the neck, we're going to take the neck, set it in the pocket. Now the key thing is that with the neck assembled in the pocket, it's going to move around a bit. And so when it moves around, we want to make sure that it doesn't. So to prevent that, we use a clamp. And so that clamp will not only squeeze the neck into place, it will make sure that the screws engage properly their locations. There is a neck plate that we need to get out of the parts bag and use. So this neck plate comes with a protective plastic coating. Now some people have put the plastic coating on the actual guitar body. This goes away. The protective coating goes away. Neck plate goes on the guitar body. And again, there's a front and a back side. The recessed surface is the front side. It's also shinier than the other side. And so with the neck, we want to squeeze the neck plate into position. So like any other screws, we want to again wax the screw before we insert it into the guitar body itself. Again, these screws can be driven in by the driver drill, but again, set the driver drill so that way it does not over torque or spin the head of the screw off. That would be bad. So I've got 3 set. We'll work on the 4th one here in just a second. We're going to grab the driver drill and slowly drive these in. We're going to squeeze the clamp to make sure the clamp is set. Make sure that the neck is firmly against the base of the guitar body when you drive this in. This is also a good time to have a buddy to hold the guitar body or clamp that into a vise. Start the screws, and I like to use the opposite method on this one, where the 2 opposite screws, you heard the clutch engage to where it doesn't over tighten the screw. Now that we've got 3 screws in place, I can unclamp it because it's not going to move. I've got 1 more screw to place. Use the driver drill again on that screw. Slowly the clutch will stop. So now we have a guitar-shaped object. As we continue our build, we'll be doing the intonation and setup of the guitar next.